The morning mist hung over Windsor Castle like a gentle blanket as Guardsman James Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for the final time. At 28 years old, he had been serving in the Queen's Guard for 6 years, but today felt different. The weight of his bearskin hat seemed heavier. The silence in the corridors more pronounced. It had been 3 months since Queen Elizabeth II had passed away, and the castle still carried an air of mourning that no amount of royal protocol could completely mask. James stood at attention outside the Queen's former private apartments, his polished boots reflecting the early autumn sunlight that streamed through the tall windows. His role had changed since the Queen's death. No longer was he protecting the beloved monarch who had ruled for 70 years. Instead, he found himself guarding memories, traditions, and the countless personal belongings that remained in her rooms, waiting to be sorted through by the royal family. The Queen's Corgis had been a constant presence during his years of service. He remembered how Her Majesty would walk them through the castle grounds, always stopping to speak kindly to the guards on duty. She had a way of making even the most formal protocols feel warm and personal. The dogs, especially Muick and Sandy, her final 2 Corgis, had become symbols of her gentle nature and love for simple pleasures amidst the grandeur of royal life. James had grown particularly fond of watching the Queen with her dogs. There was something beautifully human about seeing the monarch of 14 Commonwealth realms sitting on the floor, allowing her Corgis to climb all over her expensive clothes. The sight never failed to remind him why he had chosen to serve the crown. It wasn't just about the pageantry or the honor of the position. It was about protecting someone who, beneath all the titles and ceremonies, was simply a woman who loved her family and her dogs. After the Queen's death, the Corgis had been taken in by Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson, the Duke and Duchess of York. This arrangement had been decided by the Queen herself before her passing, as she wanted to ensure her beloved companions would be cared for by family members who understood their importance to her. The dogs had been relocated to Royal Lodge, Andrew's home in Windsor Great Park, where they could continue to live in familiar surroundings. But this morning, something unusual was happening. James had received word that Queen Camilla would be visiting the late Queen's private apartments. Since becoming Queen Consort, Camilla had been working tirelessly to honor her predecessor's memory, while also establishing her own role within the monarchy. The public had gradually warmed to her, especially after seeing how she supported King Charles during his transition to the throne and his subsequent cancer diagnosis. James had met Queen Camilla several times during official functions. She was always gracious and seemed genuinely interested in the welfare of the staff. Unlike some royals who maintained a formal distance, Camilla often asked personal questions about the guards' families and remembered details from previous conversations. She had a warmth that reminded him somewhat of the late Queen, though her approach was more direct and modern. As he stood guard, James reflected on the strict protocols that governed his position. The Queen's Guard was trained never to break character or react to external stimuli while on duty. They were human statues, symbols of unwavering British tradition and discipline. Over the years, he had maintained his composure through thunderstorms, tourist provocations, and even once when a wasp had built a nest inside his bearskin hat during a particularly long ceremony. The training had been rigorous. Every guardsman learned that their primary duty was to protect the royal family and their property, but they also served as living representations of centuries of British military tradition. Breaking protocol wasn't just a personal failing. It was a breach of trust that could reflect poorly on the entire institution. James took this responsibility seriously, perhaps more so than some of his colleagues who viewed the position as ceremonial. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps echoing down the corridor. The distinctive click of heels on marble told him that Queen Camilla was arriving. He could hear voices growing closer, including what sounded like the Queen Consort speaking to one of her ladies-in-waiting about the emotional difficulty of going through the late Queen's belongings. James straightened his already perfect posture and focused his gaze straight ahead. Whatever was about to happen, he was ready to fulfill his duty with the same unwavering dedication that had characterized his service for the past 6 years. He had no idea that in the next few minutes, he would face a situation that no amount of training had prepared him for. One that would test not just his adherence to protocol, but his understanding of loyalty, compassion, and the true meaning of service to the crown. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by a sound that made James's heart skip a beat. The distinctive patter of small paws on marble and the gentle jingling of collar tags could only mean one thing. Somehow, one of the late Queen's corgis had returned to the castle. The emotional weight of this moment wasn't lost on him. These walls had witnessed the most private moments between the Queen and her beloved dogs. And now, in some unexpected turn of events, one of them was back. James remained motionless, his training keeping him perfectly still despite the emotional significance of what he was hearing. He could sense that something important was about to unfold, something that would require him to make decisions that went far beyond the standard protocols he had memorized. The sound of the approaching entourage, combined with the unmistakable presence of one of the Queen's corgis, created an atmosphere charged with both nostalgia and uncertainty. As Queen Camilla's voice grew clearer, James could make out her gentle tone as she spoke to someone about the difficulty of this particular visit to the late Queen's private rooms. The weight of history, tradition, and personal grief was converging in this corridor, and James knew that his role as guardian was about to be tested in ways he had never anticipated. Queen Camilla appeared around the corner, accompanied by her lady-in-waiting and 2 other staff members. In her arms, she carried Muick, one of Queen Elizabeth's most cherished corgis. The small dog looked comfortable and content, his golden coat gleaming in the morning light that filtered through the castle windows. James noticed immediately that the Queen consort appeared somewhat flustered, a rare sight given her usual composed demeanor. "Your Majesty," James acknowledged with the slightest nod of his head, the only movement protocol allowed while he remained at his post. His eyes stayed fixed on the point directly ahead of him, as required, but his peripheral vision captured the scene unfolding nearby. Camilla paused near his position, speaking quietly to her companion. "I simply cannot manage to hold Muick while going through Elizabeth's jewelry collection. The poor thing keeps trying to jump down to explore his old home. I'm terrified I'll drop him or that he'll knock over something precious." Her voice carried a mixture of affection and practical concern. The lady-in-waiting, a woman in her 50s whom James recognized as Mrs. Patricia Thompson, nodded sympathetically. "Perhaps we could find somewhere secure to place him temporarily, Your Majesty. The problem is, he doesn't know these rooms anymore as they are now," Camilla continued, adjusting Muick in her arms as he wriggled slightly. "Everything has been moved about since the Queen's passing. I'm worried he might become distressed if left alone, and Charles specifically asked me to ensure the corgis remain comfortable during this transition." James felt his chest tighten as he listened to their conversation. The mention of King Charles's concern for the dog's well-being struck a personal chord. He had witnessed firsthand how much the royal family cared for these animals, not just as pets but as living connections to the late Queen's memory. Camilla looked around the corridor, her gaze eventually settling on James's still figure. An idea seemed to form in her mind, and she stepped closer to him. "Guardsman," she said gently, "you've been serving here for several years, haven't you? You knew the Queen well?" "Yes, Your Majesty," James replied, his voice steady, despite the unusual nature of the conversation. Guards typically only spoke when directly addressed by royalty, and even then, responses were expected to be brief and formal. "Muick here remembers you, I'm certain," Camilla continued. And indeed, the corgi had turned his attention toward James, his tail wagging slightly at the familiar sight of the red uniform. The Queen often mentioned how much her dogs seemed to enjoy the presence of her guards. They provided a sense of security and routine. James felt the weight of tradition pressing down on him like his heavy bearskin hat. He knew where this conversation was heading, and every instinct trained into him over 6 years of service told him to maintain his position and not deviate from protocol. Guards did not hold royal pets. Guards did not break formation. Guards remained stationary and alert, ready to respond only to threats or direct orders related to security. "I have rather a lot to accomplish in the Queen's private study this morning," Camilla continued, her voice taking on a slightly hopeful tone. "Sorting through her personal papers and jewelry requires delicate attention, and I'm concerned that holding Muick simultaneously might result in damage to some irreplaceable items." The corgi, as if understanding the conversation, looked directly at James and gave a small, friendly bark. The sound echoed off the stone walls, a sound that had once been commonplace in these corridors when the Queen was alive. James felt a tug of emotion, but forced himself to remain motionless. Camilla stepped even closer, extending Muick slightly toward James. "Would you mind terribly holding him for just an hour or so? I know it's not typical protocol, but these are rather extraordinary circumstances. Muick was so special to Elizabeth, and I feel a tremendous responsibility to ensure his comfort." This was the moment James had been dreading since the conversation began. The Queen Consort, second only to King Charles in the royal hierarchy, was making a direct request that conflicted with his fundamental training. According to protocol, his hands must remain free at all times, ready to respond to any security threat. His position required absolute stillness and attention. Taking care of a pet, no matter how beloved or historically significant, was simply not within the scope of his duties. "Your Majesty," James began carefully, his voice respectful but firm, "I regret that I cannot assist in that capacity while on duty. My position requires that I remain alert and available for any security matters that might arise." Camilla's expression showed surprise mixed with understanding. She had clearly hoped for a different response, but she seemed to recognize the validity of his position. "Of course. I understand the importance of your duties," she said, though disappointment was evident in her voice. Mrs. Thompson stepped forward at this moment. "Your Majesty, perhaps we could contact one of the household staff to assist? I'm certain someone could be found to help with Muick." But Camilla seemed reluctant to give up on her original plan. "Guardsman, surely there must be some flexibility in these situations. This is the Queen's beloved Corgi. After all, I'm not asking you to abandon your post, merely to provide temporary care for a member of the royal household." James felt the full weight of the moment pressing down on him. The Queen Consort was essentially appealing to his sense of loyalty and service, suggesting that caring for the late Queen's dog was itself a form of royal duty. It was a compelling argument, and he could see the logic in her reasoning, but his training had been explicit and unwavering. Guards maintain their position regardless of circumstances that do not involve immediate security threats. "I deeply appreciate Your Majesty's confidence in me," James replied, choosing his words carefully. "However, I must respectfully maintain my current position. Protocol requires that I remain alert and unencumbered while on duty." The corridor fell silent except for the soft sound of Muick's breathing and the distant noise of castle life continuing elsewhere. Camilla studied James's face, seemingly weighing her options. The standoff was polite, but unmistakable. The Queen Consort had made a reasonable request based on practical need and emotional significance, while the guard had responded with professional duty and adherence to established rules. James could feel sweat beginning to form under his bearskin hat despite the cool morning air. This was precisely the type of situation that military training attempted to prepare soldiers for, but no amount of theoretical discussion could fully capture the real-world complexity of refusing a direct request from a member of the royal family, especially one made with such obvious good intentions. The tension in the corridor was broken by an unexpected voice from behind them. "Your Majesty, might I be of assistance?" The voice belonged to Colonel Harrison, the officer in charge of the Queen's Guard rotation that day. He had appeared quietly, as senior officers often did when monitoring their troops, but his timing couldn't have been more fortuitous. James felt a wave of relief wash over him, though he maintained his rigid posture. Colonel Harrison was a veteran of 30 years of royal service, a man who understood both the importance of protocol and the delicate art of royal diplomacy. His presence immediately changed the dynamics of the situation. "Colonel Harrison," Queen Camilla greeted him with evident relief in her voice. "I was just explaining to your guardsman here about my dilemma with Muick. I need to spend considerable time in the Queen's private study this morning, and I'm concerned about managing both delicate paperwork and a rather energetic Corgi." Colonel Harrison glanced briefly at James, a look that conveyed both understanding and approval for the young guardsman's adherence to protocol. "I completely understand Your Majesty's situation," he replied diplomatically. "Perhaps I might suggest an alternative solution that would serve everyone's needs?" Camilla looked hopeful. "Please, any suggestions would be most welcome. We have a small antechamber adjacent to the Queen's study," Colonel Harrison explained. "It's secure, comfortable, and has been used historically for exactly these sorts of circumstances. We could arrange for one of the household staff to remain with Muick there, where he would be close enough for you to check on him but safely contained while you work. The solution was elegant in its simplicity. Camilla's face brightened immediately. That sounds perfect. Muick would be comfortable in familiar surroundings, and I could focus properly on the task at hand. As Colonel Harrison made arrangements on his radio for household staff to prepare the antechamber, Camilla turned back to James. Her expression had transformed from one of mild frustration to something approaching respect. Guardsman, I want you to know that I appreciate your dedication to your duties. Your adherence to protocol, even when faced with an unusual request, demonstrates exactly the kind of reliability and professionalism that the royal household requires. James felt a flush of pride, though his expression remained unchanged. Thank you, Your Majesty, Camilla continued. I realize now that what I was asking was not appropriate given your responsibilities. The security of the royal household must always take precedence, and I respect that you understood this even when I momentarily lost sight of it. Within minutes, Mrs. Sarah Jenkins, one of the senior housekeeping staff who had worked with the Queen's Corgis for over a decade, arrived to escort Muick to the prepared antechamber. As she took the dog from Camilla's arms, Muick wagged his tail and seemed perfectly content with the arrangement. He remembers you, Mrs. Jenkins, Camilla observed with a smile. I'm so grateful that so many staff members who cared for these dogs during the Queen's lifetime are still here to help with their transition. As the small group began to move toward the Queen's study, Colonel Harrison remained briefly with James. Well handled, Guardsman, he said quietly. I know that couldn't have been easy. James finally allowed himself a small smile. Thank you, sir. I wasn't entirely certain I was making the right choice. You were, Colonel Harrison assured him. Protocol exists for important reasons, and part of respecting the royal family is maintaining the standards they depend on, even when it might seem easier to bend the rules. Queen Camilla understands this, which is why she ultimately appreciated your position. After Colonel Harrison departed, James was left alone in the corridor once again. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting different patterns of light through the windows. The encounter had lasted less than 30 minutes, but it felt like a significant moment in his service career. Over the following weeks, James noticed subtle changes in how Queen Camilla interacted with the guards. She seemed to have gained a deeper appreciation for the complexities of their role and the importance of the protocols they were required to follow. During subsequent visits to Windsor Castle, she would acknowledge the guards with a nod that conveyed respect for their professional boundaries, while maintaining the warmth that characterized her personality. The story of the encounter spread quietly through the ranks of the Queen's Guard, not as gossip, but as an example of how to handle difficult situations with dignity and professionalism. Senior officers began using it as a teaching moment for new recruits, illustrating the importance of maintaining standards while treating everyone, including royalty, with appropriate respect. For James, the incident became a defining moment in his understanding of what it truly meant to serve the crown. It wasn't just about standing still in a red uniform or following orders without question. True service meant understanding the principles behind the protocols and having the courage to uphold those principles even in challenging circumstances. 6 months later, James was promoted to Lance Corporal, a recognition that took into account not only his technical competence, but also his demonstrated judgment and integrity. During the promotion ceremony, Colonel Harrison made specific reference to James's ability to balance respect for the royal family with adherence to essential protocols. The Queen's Corgis, meanwhile, continued to thrive in their new home with Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson. Occasionally, they would visit Windsor Castle, where they seemed to remember the familiar corridors and the guards who had been part of their daily lives during Queen Elizabeth's reign. James always felt a special warmth when he saw them, remembering the morning when one of them had been at the center of his most challenging professional moment. Years later, when James had been promoted to sergeant and was training new recruits, he would tell the story of Queen Camilla and Muick as an illustration of the complexities of royal service. The royal family depends on us to maintain certain standards, he would explain to the young guardsman. Sometimes that means saying no, even to people we deeply respect. But when you do it with professionalism and courtesy, you earn respect in return. The incident also contributed to subtle changes in protocol. Guidelines were developed for situations involving the royal pets, creating clear procedures that would prevent similar conflicts in the future. The royal household recognized that as the family evolved and circumstances changed, their operational procedures needed to evolve as well. Queen Camilla never again asked a guard to hold one of the corgis, but she continued to show appreciation for their service in countless other ways. The mutual respect that emerged from that morning encounter became emblematic of the relationship between the working royal family and the dedicated professionals who served them. It demonstrated that true loyalty sometimes required the courage to maintain principles, even when doing so might seem difficult or uncomfortable in the moment.